Hello everyone and welcome to my bookshelf tour. I've had a lot of you ask me for this the past few months, so I'm going to give you a tour of this great wall of books that I have behind me. So just a little background on how I have all of this sorted. Basically, fiction is over here, nonfiction is a small section of that very last shelf. I have them organized essentially hardcover all the way down to mass market paperbacks, so it's basically sorted by size. And then alphabetically, but I have some dedicated shelves because I found it really difficult when I had everything alphabetically that I read a new Joe Abercrombie and it was top left and I had to rearrange five shelves. So this is going to be my bookshelf tour. But before I get started, of course, like and subscribe. If you see the books that you like to read on this shelf, it's probably the kind of books that I will generally talk about. Before I get started, though, I'm going to go ahead and show you two other things that you don't see in any of the videos. So the first thing we're looking at here is actually my physical TBR shelf. And it's important I show this first because every single book in that wall of books is something that I've actually read. I've seen a bunch of these bookshelf tours where it seems like half of the books that the booktuber is showing you they haven't actually read. And nothing against those kinds of things. I know a lot of people like them for home decor, but ever since I was little, I would not put a book on my bookshelf until I've actually read it. So every book that you see on that bookshelf, except for two exceptions, are things that I've read and enjoyed. Right here is my physical TBR, so you can just kind of glance at that and see some of the things that I will be talking about, but I don't want to highlight that because I don't know anything about those books yet. So on to the next thing that I show you before we look at the general wall. So before I get into the big wall of books, I have another bookshelf on this opposite wall in my study, which is comprised of basically music texts. I am a musician, so I have a lot of books on music, and it has its own dedicated shelf. So we'll look just very briefly at some of the detail of this shelf next. Okay, so I'm going to go through all this shelf pretty quickly, because I know most of you, this isn't probably why you're here to look at the kind of books that I talk about. So a lot of these are textbooks from college. And then on the right, you see the beginning of a lot of books about Beethoven. Beethoven is my favorite composer as well as my favorite historical figure and just a source of inspiration for me. So this is kind of the top shelf of this music shelf. The next shelf down are some assorted orchestral scores of pieces that I've either performed, conducted, or studied at some point. And then the third shelf down, you see more of my historic books. I have, you can tell I like the Germans, more Beethoven, some Wagner, a bunch of texts on conducting and so forth, things like that. The fourth shelf down, some more music scores, some more textbooks, and just some books that I've picked up along the way that just kind of fit on the shelf. And then at the very bottom, we just have some actual workbooks and things like that that I did in college. Okay, on to the general book wall. So I have 5 different shelving units, and then you see that there are 6 rows of each. So we're going to start top left with some of the dedicated shelves that I have. So my first dedicated shelf is the Wheel of Time. These are the Juniper book dust covers, dust jackets, whatever you call them. And they are really fantastic, and it's just a nice cornerstone to my collection here. If you've seen the original spines of the Robert Jordan Wheel of Time, they don't match, and they don't look very good. But these Juniper, it was worth the price that I paid for them, and you see it's just a nice, really nice way to showcase that great series that I love. And it's amazing how perfectly it happens to fit in my shelf. So it's also fitting that the next shelf down, we have some works by Brandon Sanderson. So this is my Sander shelf. Now, I'm not going to highlight every single book on this shelf or this video on this entire book wall, or this video will take forever, but I will highlight some of the dedicated shelves, starting with Sanderson. So we have Mistborn Era 1, Mistborn The Final Empire, The Well of Ascension, The Hero of Ages. We have Mistborn Era 2, The Alloy of Law, Shadows of Self, The Bands of Mourning, and I'm looking forward to The Lost Metal being released later this year. 4 books of the Stormlight Archive, The Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, Oathbringer, and Rhythm of War. Looking forward to Volume 5 coming out next year. And some standalones, Elantris, Warbreaker, Arcanum Unbounded. So that's the Sander shelf, which is certain to grow As fast as that guy writes, we'll have 2, 3, 4 shelves before we know it. Okay, next shelf down is some classic fantasy authors. Someday I hope that this will be a J.R.R. Tolkien shelf, but you see we have some J.R.R. Tolkien, some George R.R. Martin, and Robert E. Howard. Let's look at some of those individually. This is the deluxe omnibus edition of The Lord of the Rings that was released last year. You can see a full review unboxing video from me on that video if you want to look at that. I have the Easton Press, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion. These are gorgeous leather bounds. Another gorgeous leather bound that I have is the Complete Chronicles of Conan by Robert E. Howard. This is a centenary edition, and it just looks perfect next to that omnibus edition of The Lord of the Rings. And the 5 hardcovers of George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, A Game of Thrones, Clash of Kings, A Storm of Swords, A Feast for Crows, and A Dance with Dragons. I'm anxiously awaiting The Winds of Winter, aren't we all? And 2 others on the shelf, George R.R. Martin's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fall of Gondolin. And once again, this shelf I hope someday will just be Tolkien, so I might have to kick Martin out at some point. Okay, the next dedicated shelf down is to David Eddings, who was one of my favorite fantasy authors in the 80s. He's kind of fallen out of favor a little bit because, yes, he's a bit tropey and a bit formulaic, but especially his early works that I really love. Eddings' best series, in my opinion, is The Belgariad. You see Pawn of Prophecy is hardcover, the other 4, Queen of Sorcery, Magician's Gambit, Castle of Wizardry, and Enchanter's Endgame, are paperback, which are actually the first edition of these. The Pawn of Prophecy is a Grim Oak Press edition that has just recently been released, and the second book is actually arriving next week, but didn't make it in time for this. But I'm looking forward over the next couple years to get these gorgeous Grim Oak Press versions of the Belgariad so that I have all hardcovers of my David Eddings collection. Eddings' second series in the same world as the Belgariad is the Malorian. Those 5 books are Guardians of the West, King of the Murgos, Demon Lord of Karanda, Sorceress of Darshiva, and the Seeress of Kel. Eddings wrote 3 standalones in the world of the Belgariad, Belgarath the Sorcerer, Polgara the Sorceress, and the Riven Codex, which is kind of a memoir as well. And I also have the hardcovers to his series called the Elenium, which consists of the Diamond Throne, the Ruby Knight, and the Sapphire Rose. So Eddings has a couple other series and a few standalones I have not read, but I'm probably done reading Eddings. It seemed to me that the more he came back to the same formulas, the worse he got. So I'm probably not going to revisit anymore, but he does deserve his own shelf. I got all of these future hardcovers, and I do love the Belgariad. Okay, next shelf down. This is kind of a young adult fantasy shelf. Now, this shelf consists of one of my exceptions to my rule of having read everything on this bookshelf, and that's with the books of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. As of filming this, I've only read the first one, but I will read all 5 or all 6 of those by probably the end of April. So I've only read one of those so far, but that illustrated edition looks so great on this shelf with these other great works. Starting with the Harry Potter books, I'm keeping them like this because the Juniper editions that I have here with these dust jackets are such an improvement over the original. Although I love the original dust covers, the whimsical covers of Harry and so forth, the spines aren't very good, and we see the spines on the bookshelf, so the spines are very important. So I got these through Juniper, and I really enjoy them. And I have 2 box sets here. These are, coincidentally, the first 2 fantasy book series I ever read. 6th grade, middle school, taking them off the shelf in my middle school library. Lloyd Alexander's The Chronicles of Prydain, and C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. I reread Prydain this year. I plan on rereading Narnia next year. So the bottom shelf of this, which is kind of a fantasy shelf, is where my alphabetical hardcovers start. Pretty soon, though, this is going to be a Robin Hobb shelf. As soon as I get enough of her books, she deserves her own shelf, if not her own shrine, as far as I'm concerned. For all of the alphabetical entries in this bookshelf tour, I'm only going to highlight my favorites. I'm not going to show you every single book. Again, this would be the longest video I've ever made, and I don't think anybody wants to watch all of that. So I will highlight some of the things I really enjoy on each of these shelves in the alphabetical section of the bookshelf. Starting with Joe Abercrombie, one of my favorite authors that I first read last year. I have the First Law trilogy, that's the box set, The Blade Itself, Before They Are Hanged, Last Argument of Kings, and then the 3 standalones, Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country. Kate Atkinson is one of my favorite authors of literary fiction, and these are 5 of her works: Behind the Scenes of the Museum, A God in Ruins, Human Croquet, Life After Life, and Transcription. Life After Life and A God in Ruins are 2 of my top 15 books of all time. A God in Ruins is probably my favorite book of all time. A book I don't hear talked about very often that I love is The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. It's a retelling of the Arthur legend from the perspective of the women in the tale, and I found it quite brilliant. And the last thing I'm going to highlight on this shelf is the Red Rising trilogy by Pierce Brown. Red Rising, Golden Sun, and Morning Star. One of the best science fiction trilogies I've ever read. All right, my next shelf is Stephen King. About 4.5 of the shelves, of the 6 shelves of this bookshelf are dedicated to Stephen King, my favorite author. So let's look at these a little more carefully, a little more closely. So I have these organized just kind of how good they look on the shelf. So the top shelf, I have It as kind of the focus, and then you see some that were published together around the same time. Misery, Gerald's Game, Needful Things, Nightmares and Dreamscapes, 4 Past Midnight, Dolores Claiborne, and then some of King's older works. We have Different Seasons, Cujo, Carrie, Firestarter, Skeleton Crew, The Tommyknockers, Christine, The Talisman, who he wrote with Peter Straub, as well as Black House, which he wrote with Peter Straub. Second shelf of King features one of my favorite works by King, and that is the novel 11/22/63. So you see to the left of that, we have Sleeping Beauties, which he wrote with his son Owen King, Bizarre Bad Dreams, the Bill Hodges trilogy, which is Mr. Mercedes, Finders Keepers, and End of Watch. And then to the right of 11/22/63, you see some of the newer ones: Full Dark, No Stars, The Institute, The Outsider, If It Bleeds, Pet Sematary, Billy Summers, Just After Sunset, The Dark Half, Bag of Bones, and The Eyes of the Dragon. And again, all of these are organized just kind of by roughly when they're published together and basically how well they look together on the shelf. Third row starts with The Dark Tower. I have The Gunslinger, although that's not my favorite book of The Dark Tower. I think that cover is just perfect for this shelf. I'm going to go ahead and show you all of the covers of The Dark Tower. So the first 4 books of The Dark Tower, you see The Gunslinger, the drawing of the 3, The Wastelands, Wizard and Glass. Continuing, we have Wolves of the Kala, Book 5, Song of Susanna, The Dark Tower, which is the conclusion, and then The Wind Through the Keyhole, which is a story within a story within a story that happens in the middle of the saga, but was written afterwards. And continuing on that shelf, we have Duma Key, Cell, Under the Dome, Lisey's Story, Insomnia, and The Dead Zone. Okay, on to the 4th shelf, more Stephen King, and then some Richard Bachman as well. So The Stand is the featured book here, one of King's best. And then to the left of The Stand, you see some reprints of Night Shift, Salem's Lot, and The Shining. Then we have Dr. Sleep, Rose Madder, and Revival. To the right, have some of these just grouped together because the white looks good together. We have Storm of the Century, Dreamcatcher, The Green Mile, Hearts in Atlantis, Everything's Eventual, From a Buick 8. And then we begin with the Bachman portion of Stephen King's works: Thinner, the 4 early novels published as the Bachman books, Blaze, then a couple Stephen Kings that are just shorter than the standard hardcover, Cycle of the Werewolf and The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And the last half shelf here of Stephen King, I have Desperation and The Regulators prominently displayed because I just love this artwork, how it seamlessly goes together. If you've not read these two works, King writes using the same characters and writes two very different tales, one as Bauckham and one as King. I found Desperation a 5 out of 5, and I think Regulars was about a 3 out of 5, but still very good companion pieces. And I just love the way that these covers link together. And then to the left of this, we have some of King's other works. We have On Writing, Joyland, Later, The Colorado Kid, Blockade Billy, and Elevation. The second half of this shelf is some Michael Connelly. I'm just going to show you those there. These are the paperbacks that I have of Michael Connelly. The next shelf is all of my Michael Connelly hardcovers. And it works real well to have this shelf because these are probably my two favorite authors of all time. Stephen King, #1, Michael Connelly, #2. And the bottom shelf here, we have all of my Michael Connelly hardcovers. I may upgrade those paperbacks at some point, but I'm not in a hurry to do that. I have everything that he's written in print version. You see the first 3 on the left are just omnibus editions of the first 9 Harry Bosch novels, and then a lot of them after that I purchased as they came out, or I purchased them later. But I have all of those hardcovers except for the top shelf. So they'll probably have a couple more Connelly shelves before he's done as well, because he's another one that is highly prolific and writes pretty quick. All right, on to shelf number 3. These are my leather bounds, and up here is my second exception to my I have to read a book before I put it on the shelf rule. And that's because of these editions of Charles Dickens. These are the Easton Press from the 1970s that I started collecting. I initially bought 3 that I had read, and I basically just pick them up when I find one at a price that I can stomach. So because of that, I haven't read all of these. I read my first 4 Dickens novels in 4 consecutive summers, and I'm going to start doing that streak again. So of these Dickens novels, the ones that I have read from left to right are The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations. The ones I have not read are Nicholas Nickleby, Barnaby Rudge, The Old Curiosity Shop, Martin Chuzzlewit, Little Dorrit, and The Mystery of Edwin Drood. And also on this shelf, we have James Clavell's Shogun, which I did a dedicated review of that in January. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. That's a Barnes & Noble edition. That's one of my favorite books of all time. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas, another Barnes & Noble edition that I love. And then A Hero Born by Jin Yong. This was my first Folio Society purchase. First of probably many before I'm done. And I did a separate unboxing video of that if you'd like to check it out. All right, one last dedicated shelf before we resume our alphabetical look at my hardcovers. This is an Isaac Asimov and Frank Herbert shelf. So for Asimov, these are the Foundation novels, the Foundation trilogy in the middle, the 2 preludes, prequels on the left, Prelude and Forward, the Foundation, and then Foundation and Earth, and Foundation's Edge, which is these faux blue leather editions with the really cool covers of Asimov, which I have more of those I'll show you in a second. So we have Asimov's robot novels. On the left is I, Robot, followed by Caves of Steel, The Naked Sun, The Robots of Dawn, Robots and Empire. I also have, just to fill up space, 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke, as well as Nightfall and Other Stories by Isaac Asimov. And Frank Herbert's Dune novels. Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. Okay, back to my alphabetical hardcovers. So for the alphabeticals, I'm not going to highlight everything, but there's some Chelsea Cain there. She wrote some great crime fiction novels set in Portland. And then my Bernard Cornwell collection, which I do want to show you a little more in detail. This is Cornwell's Grail Quest series. It's really a trilogy with kind of a book that loosely ties in because it shares some characters. The trilogy is The Archer's Tale, which was published as Harlequin in England, Vagabond, and Heretic. And then the final book, which is kind of an afterword, could be read alone, but works a little better if you've read the trilogy. That's 1356 and concerns the Battle of Poitiers. Brilliant works by Cornwell. Another short series of Cornwell is the Starbuck Chronicles, set in the American Civil War. Those 4 books are Rebel, Copperhead, Battle Flag, and The Bloody Ground. And in my opinion, Cornwell's finest work is the 3 Arthur novels, The Warlord Chronicles, The Winter King, Enemy of God, and Excalibur. This is a top 5 book series for me and is a historical fiction rendering of the King Arthur tale. A highly overlooked and underrated trilogy is Justin Cronin's trilogy, The Passage, The 12, and The City of Mirrors. Next shelf down, we have some more Justin Cronin, some Stephen Dobbins, some Gillian Flynn, some Robert Galbraith, and I adore these 4 books by Ken Follett. It began with the second one from the left, The Pillars of the Earth, followed by its sequel, World Without End, the next sequel, Column of Fire, and then the prequel, The Evening and the Morning. Thomas Harris's 4 books about Hannibal Lecter are all excellent, especially Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs, and then Hannibal and Hannibal Rising. Next shelf down, we have the 10 books of L. Ron Hubbard, the Mission Earth series, which I have not read since high school, so I don't know if it's any good. A few others I'd like to highlight. So 3 very good books on this shelf. A Farewell to Arms, which is my favorite of Hemingway. Hemingway is not a favorite author of mine, but I love A Farewell to Arms. The Old Man and the Sea is a good tale. And a really great recent book is Hex by Thomas Oldhoyvelt. One of the best horror novels I've read in quite some time. Also on this shelf is Stieg Larsson's trilogy, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Girl Who Played with Fire, and The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest. And the end of the bottom shelf is the end of the full-size hardcovers, and we start to see some shorter hardcovers, taller paperbacks as we work our way down to the mass markets. Some highlights of this shelf include Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami, The Terror by Dan Simmons, The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, and the one on the end is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. 2 works by Tolstoy, Anna Karenina and War and Peace, both Pavir and Volhansky translations, and A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. All right, next shelf. So we're not really alphabetical anymore. From this point on, it's kind of by height. So you'll see some short hardcovers and some tall paperbacks. Because I want to point out something to you. These 2 books are both trade paperbacks, and they're about an inch different in height, and it drives me crazy as a book collector. So that's why I have them organized by height, because it looks kind of bad on the shelf, at least for my aesthetic, when these 2 books would be next to each other. Some highlights of this shelf include The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood, Dracula by Bram Stoker, The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny. Also on this shelf, and bleeding into the next one, is my Steinbeck collection. This is from the Centennial Edition. Cannery Row, East of Eden, The Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, The Pearl, and Travels with Charlie in Search of America. Okay, so here's a glance at my next shelf down. Some highlights of this shelf include the Everman Library editions of George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, 3 works by Dostoyevsky, again translated by Pavir and Volhansky, The Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, and The Idiot. An illustration how publishers drive me crazy. You see how different in height these 4 books by John Irving are, but I love the books themselves. The Hotel New Hampshire, A Prayer for Owen Meany, The World According to Garp, and The Cider House Rules. 2 other books on this shelf that I absolutely love are Forever by Pete Hamill and Circe by Madeline Miller. So here's our next shelf. Some of my favorites from this shelf include 2 works by Wilkie Collins on the left. Wilkie Collins is highly underrated. I think he's just as good as Dickens. He's a contemporary of Charles Dickens. The 2 books there are The Moonstone and The Woman in White, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, The Sheltering Sky by Paul Bowles, and Watership Down by Richard Adams. And some more highlights from this shelf. More of my Russian literature on the left. We have The Collected Tales of Nikolai Gogol, Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol, Selected Stories of Anton Chekhov, Pride and Prejudice, Where I'm Calling From. It's a collection of short stories by Raymond Carver, who's probably the best in that genre, and then Blake Crouch's Dark Matter. One more from this shelf that I love is Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. There's a lot to love in this next shelf because two of my favorite authors, Dennis Lehane and Haruki Murakami, are on here, so I'll highlight all of theirs. Starting with three others I loved: Neil Gaiman's American Gods, The Beach by Alex Garland, and The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. Four works by Dennis Lehane: A Drink Before the War, Darkness Take My Hand, Gone Baby Gone, Prayers for Rain. All four of those are in the Kenzie and Gennaro mystery series. Four more by Lehane: Sacred, Moonlight Mile, both in the Kenzie and Gennaro series, and then two standalones, Shutter Island and Mystic River. Four more to highlight. This is a really great row of books that I love. Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, Atonement by Ian McEwan, Dead Man's Walk by Larry McMurtry. And my Murakami selection starts here. I have After Dark, which is only the prominent one. It's not my favorite one, but I love that cover. Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, Sputnik Sweetheart. Next shelf down, you can see prominently on the right-hand side Maurice Drouillon's Accursed Kings series. We have some Murakami to start and then some Robin Hobb to finish. Five works by Murakami here: Norwegian Wood, A Wild Sheep Chase, Dance, 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 The Elephant Vanishes, and South of the Border, West of the Sun. Some more individual books that I enjoy on this shelf: Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak, Empire Falls by Richard Russo, The Light Between Oceans, M.L. Stedman, The Miracle Life of Edgar Mintz, Brady Udall, The Martian by Andy Weir, and The Power of the Dog by Don Winslow, not to be confused with the Western movie that has just been released. Two works by Victor Hugo, Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Robin Hobb's The Farseer trilogy, consisting of Assassin's Apprentice, Royal Assassin, and Assassin's Quest. So the bottom shelf, we finished the trade paperbacks, work our way into the standard mass market paperbacks, which are all alphabetical. Some highlights of this shelf include Robin Hobb's Live Ship Traders trilogy, consisting of Ship of Magic, The Mad Ship, The Ship of Destiny. Robin Hobb's The Tawny Man trilogy, consisting of Fool's Errand, The Golden Fool, and Fool's Fate. Look for a review for that trilogy from me very soon. And some to highlight to close out this shelf include Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and the Sword of Shannara series. You see the sword there, Elfstones, Wish Song, and then the first three books of the Heritage of Shannara finish out this shelf. All right, last shelf, I'm going to kind of do a flyby with this. We have the end of the Terry Brooks collection that I have, the Heritage of Shannara final book there. Then we have Orson Scott Card's Ender Saga, 5 books. Ender Shadow series, the little gap there, that's because I'm actually reading that right now. Look for a review for that next week. 6 works by Stephen R. Donaldson. These are the 2 trilogies that are the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever. Haven't read those since the 80s. I have to reread those soon. My Raymond E. Feist collection, Fairy Tale, the 4 books of the Rift War Saga, the 2 books of Krondor's Sons. Need to read more of those soon. Next shelf down finishes out my fiction and then starts my small nonfiction collection. So on the left here we have the Iron Tower trilogy by Dennis L. McKiernan. You see some Salinger there. Once and Future King by T.H. White. And then my Dragonlance collection. Chronicles trilogy, the Legends trilogy, Tales volumes 1, 2, 3, Heroes volumes 1, 2, 3, and Preludes volumes 1, 2, 3. My nonfiction starts over here with a small history section. Some of my favorite works of history. Barbara Tuchman is one. The March of Folly, From Troy to Vietnam, fantastic book. I plan on reading more of her for sure. And my Eric Larson collection. Devil in the White City, Dead Wake, In the Garden of Beasts, and Isaac's Storm. All right, third shelf down. We start on the left with just some works of philosophy, heavy on Camus. And then I begin a section which is memoirs and biographies that I enjoy. So some of the better memoirs and biographies I have featured here. Catherine the Great, Portrait of a Woman by Robert K. Massey. Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. Pops by Terry Teachout. Lazarus and the Hurricane by Sam Chaitin and Terry Swinton. And a few more to look at. Peter Guralnick's masterful 2-volume biography of Elvis Presley, The Rise of Elvis Presley, Last Train to Memphis, and The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, Careless Love. We have the autobiography of Miles Davis, The Choice by Dr. Edith Ava Eger, and Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. All right, this shelf has books about sports figures, gambling, liquor, and travel. What else is there? My fourth shelf down, I used to be a competitive distance runner, and these are all the books that I read about running. Some of them training manuals, some of them nutritional manuals, some of them just books about stories about distance running. And my final shelf, have some comics there. The Real Classy Complete Bloom County. Loved Bloom County back in the day. You see my only true comic books in there. Serenity, which is, of course, from the show Firefly. I have some books about Lost, Dazed and Confused, just things that I enjoy. Harry Potter. And then a couple books by my favorite television critic, Alan Sepinwall. And that closes out the bookshelf. So that is it. That is my bookshelf tour. This is going to take forever to edit, but I hope that a lot of you enjoyed this. If you saw something I didn't talk about, a book, and you just want my take on it, please let me know. I'd love to talk with you in the comments section below. As always, like and subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Goodreads for more content. Thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.